1 inch. That was all that separated life from death. On a frozen Roman morning in 1943, a thin white line appeared across the ancient stones of St. Peter's Square. To tourists it meant nothing. Just paint on cobblestone. But to the man standing behind it, that line was more dangerous than any battlefield in Europe. On one side stood the Nazi war machine. 10,000 SS troops filled the streets around the Vatican. Gestapo agents hid in cafes, churches, and apartments. Snipers watched from rooftops. Tanks waited inside roads, engines humming. Orders from Berlin were clear: crush resistance, burn Rome if necessary, and leave no witnesses. On the other side of the line stood one man. He had no weapon, no guards, no army. He didn't even have a knife. Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty was 6 feet 2 inches tall, broad-shouldered, Irish, and dressed in a simple priest's robe. In his hand was a prayer book. In his chest, a heart pounding with pure adrenaline. The Nazi commander facing him screamed insults in German. He spat on the ground. Then he raised his Luger pistol and aimed it directly at the priest's chest. "The moment you step 1 inch beyond this line," he shouted, "you will be shot." Most men would have turned back. Most men would have hidden. Most men would have prayed and waited. O'Flaherty checked his watch. He had places to be. This is not a story about religion. This is a story about the most dangerous game of cat and mouse played during World War II. A story about how one untrained spy humiliated the Third Reich using confidence, disguises, and raw nerve. The Nazis gave him a nickname they whispered in frustration: the Scarlet Pimpernel of the Vatican. To them he wasn't a priest. He was a ghost. To understand how this began, you need to understand the monster hunting him. His name was Herbert Kappler. Kappler wasn't loud. He didn't shout. He didn't rage like the movie villains. He was worse. Calm, polite, precise. He treated murder like accounting. When German forces occupied Rome in September 1943, Kappler set up headquarters in a building on Via Tasso. Even today, Romans lower their voices when they say that name. Kappler turned that beautiful apartment building into a factory of terror. Windows were sealed shut. Lights burned day and night. Prisoners lost all sense of time. Screams echoed so constantly that neighbors crossed the street to avoid hearing them. Kappler's mission was simple: find the Jews. Find escaped Allied soldiers. Find resistance fighters. Erase them. At first, the Nazis succeeded. Rome froze in fear. Inside the Vatican walls, life was different. The Vatican was neutral. Untouchable. A tiny island of safety in a city under occupation. And Hugh O'Flaherty lived comfortably there. He was a senior Vatican official, well-respected, well-connected. He played golf in the mornings. Ate dinner with cardinals at night. He could have ignored the war. But O'Flaherty had a problem. He couldn't look away. Before the occupation, he spent years visiting prisoner-of-war camps across Italy. He brought letters, books, and chocolate to captured British and American soldiers. He knew their names, their families, their dreams. When Italy surrendered and Germany took control, those camps collapsed. Thousands of Allied soldiers escaped into the countryside with no food, no weapons, and no direction. They all headed to one place: Rome. At night, starving and injured men appeared at the Vatican gates. They whispered one name: the Irish priest. O'Flaherty knew the risk. Helping them meant breaking neutrality. It meant execution if caught. It meant dragging the Vatican into war. He paced his room. Looked down at German patrols below his window. Then he opened the door. He began small. One apartment. 3 British soldiers. Civilian clothes. Fake papers. Everything improvised. Everything dangerous. 3 became 10. 10 became 20. Soon, Rome overflowed with men who officially did not exist. Then came October 16, 1943. At dawn, Nazi trucks rolled into the Jewish ghetto. Families were dragged from beds. Children were thrown into vehicles. Over 1,000 people vanished in hours. O'Flaherty watched. No army came. No rescue arrived. The world stayed silent. That morning, something inside him hardened. This was no longer charity. This was war. He built a network from people no one suspected. A singer who distracted Nazi officers. A widow who hid refugees in bathtubs. Teenagers who ran messages through alleyways. Priests, diplomats, servants. They didn't just hide people. They erased them. But hiding thousands required money. Food. Bribes. O'Flaherty had none. So he made a promise no banker would dare make. Wealthy foreigners signed over frozen funds to him on nothing but trust. Millions flowed through his hands. By winter he was protecting thousands. And Kappler noticed. Patterns appeared. Prisoners vanished. Jews disappeared before raids. Whispers led back to one place: the Vatican. Kapler ordered O'Flaherty followed day and night. And that's when the priest smiled. Because if the Nazis wanted a game, he was ready to play. By the winter of 1943, Herbert Kapler was certain of one thing: the Irish priest was guilty. Men did not vanish into thin air. Food did not appear in sealed cities. Money did not flow through black markets without direction. Someone was coordinating it all, and every trail led back to the Vatican walls. Kapler didn't need proof yet. He needed pressure. He ordered Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty watched every hour of the day. Gestapo agents rotated shifts. One waited near the Vatican gates pretending to read a newspaper. Another followed at a distance. Taxi drivers were paid to report movements. Cafe owners were instructed to listen. Kapler believed surveillance would break him. He didn't understand the man he was hunting. O'Flaherty noticed the tail on the very first day. A shadow that stopped when he stopped. A stranger who appeared twice on the same street. A reflection in a shop window that didn't belong. Most men would panic. O'Flaherty adjusted his strategy. He turned the hunt into sport. Rome was filled with checkpoints now. Bridges guarded. Papers inspected. German soldiers searched for a tall Irish priest with a heavy walk and a confident stride. So one morning O'Flaherty went to the Vatican heating plant. He found a sack of coal. He rubbed the black dust into his hair, across his face, down his hands. He pulled on a torn worker's jacket and an old flat cap. Then he hunched his shoulders, bending his tall frame into something smaller. Minutes later he walked out of the Vatican gates. German sentries barely glanced at him. He crossed a bridge packed with SS troops. Walked past a checkpoint. Delivered money to a safe house. Then calmly returned the same way. On his way back he passed 2 Gestapo agents searching for him. He tipped his cap. They didn't look twice. That night, O'Flaherty washed the coal dust off, put on his priest's robe, and attended evening prayers like nothing had happened. The disguises multiplied. One day he was a postman carrying letters. Another day a construction worker. Another day an old peasant with a limp. Once, for a delivery that required crossing the city during a major search operation, he did something absurd. He dressed as a nun. A 6'2" Irishman in a nun's habit should have been ridiculous. But O'Flaherty understood something the Nazis didn't. Confidence was camouflage. He walked with purpose. He didn't avoid soldiers. He walked straight through them. Guards looked away, embarrassed to stop a nun. The disguise worked not because it was perfect, but because it was unthinkable. Kapler was furious. Reports came in daily. Sightings contradicted each other. The priest was seen near the river, then across town minutes later. Some claimed he never left the Vatican. Others swore they spoke to him in markets. Kapler felt mocked. So he escalated. He began raiding safe houses. Italian families were dragged from their homes. Not just the refugees, but the helpers, mothers, fathers, teenagers. They were taken to Via Tasso and interrogated under lights that never turned off. Kapler wanted one thing: a name, a signature, a witness. The pressure on O'Flaherty became unbearable. Every visit risked exposing innocent people. Every movement could lead the Gestapo to another hiding place. Then one night the game nearly ended. O'Flaherty was in a palace basement delivering supplies when boots thundered above him. The door exploded inward. German voices filled the halls. Gestapo. Nobody move. He was trapped. There was no back exit. No hidden corridor. Only a narrow coal chute leading to the street above. The footsteps came closer. O'Flaherty didn't hesitate. He climbed. The chute scraped his skin raw. Coal dust filled his lungs. His robe tore as he forced his body upward. Below him, the basement door crashed open. He burst out onto the street. SS trucks filled the road. A German soldier turned and saw him rising from the ground, blackened and gasping. For a split second, the soldier hesitated. O'Flaherty didn't run. He stood up, dusted himself off, walked calmly toward a group of civilians, speaking Italian as if he had simply stumbled upon the scene. That hesitation saved his life. A car screeched to a halt beside him. A network driver. O'Flaherty jumped in as bullets shattered the pavement behind them. Kapler knew then. This was no amateur. This was war. He made his boldest move yet. A white line was painted across St. Peter's Square, the exact boundary of Vatican sovereignty. Snipers took positions. Gestapo agents filled the cafes nearby. Kapler sent a message that required no encryption. If you cross this line, you die. Kapler believed he had won. The priest was trapped inside the Vatican. His network was outside, starving and desperate. But Kapler misunderstood again. O'Flaherty was not trying to survive. He was preparing something bigger. Every evening at sunset, the doors of St. Peter's Basilica opened. And out walked Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty. He strolled down the steps, pipe in his mouth, and stopped exactly 1 inch from the white line. He stood there for an hour, calmly smoking, staring directly at the men ordered to kill him. He waved. He smiled. The Gestapo burned with rage. They watched him, fixated, waiting for a mistake. While they watched the steps, O'Flaherty's runners slipped out through side exits. The game had entered its most dangerous phase. And the priest was just getting started. By the winter of 1943, Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty's operation was no longer just a few hiding places for escaped soldiers. It had grown into a full-fledged underground network, a shadow government operating inside a city under occupation. It began modestly. A small apartment outside the Vatican, 3 British soldiers hidden inside. Food, money and forged documents smuggled past the Swiss guards. But once O'Flaherty proved it could be done, the network expanded faster than anyone could imagine. 3 became 10. 10 became 30. Within weeks, dozens of safe houses were scattered across Rome. The beauty of it was that the Nazis never suspected the people most likely to resist. They looked for professional spies and army officers. They never imagined a widow with 6 children could harbor fugitives. Or a famous singer could smuggle documents while charming Gestapo officers at her parties. O'Flaherty recruited them all. There was Dia Murphy, the Irish ambassador's wife, a celebrated singer who entertained Nazi officers in gilded salons. While they drank champagne and hummed along to her songs, she would slip forged identification papers into her handbag and smuggle them across the city. There was Henrietta Chevalier, a Maltese widow with 6 children and a small apartment. When asked if she could hide 2 refugees, she replied, "Send me 4." Soon her tiny home was overflowing. Men slept in the bathtub and on the kitchen floor. He recruited a Vatican sweep boy to act as a messenger, 2 young New Zealand priests to carry letters, and even a Swiss count who could move freely without raising suspicion. Together, they formed what O'Flaherty called the Council. The Council didn't just hide people, they erased them. They set up safe houses in convents, private apartments, brothels, even directly next to SS barracks. Locations changed constantly. Refugees were moved from one building to another within hours. The Nazis could never trace them. But managing this network required money. Rent, food, bribes, the operation drained every resource he had. O'Flaherty invented a modern solution. He located British and American expats whose money was trapped in Italian banks. The Nazis threatened to seize their assets. O'Flaherty made them an offer: "Hand over your frozen funds, I will use it to save lives. After the war you will be reimbursed with interest." Millions of lira began flowing into his hands. Every penny was dedicated to survival. And with this money the council was unstoppable. By November 1943, O'Flaherty was protecting more than 3,000 refugees. Every name, every address, every resource was meticulously tracked in a single ledger that he carried on his person at all times. Imagine that. In a city crawling with Nazi spies, he held the single most dangerous object in Rome in his pocket. A ledger that, if discovered, could have meant death for thousands. Yet he slept with it under his pillow, carried it through the streets, and never hesitated. Kapler noticed. The patterns were too perfect. Allied soldiers shot down over Rome disappeared before SS patrols could catch them. Jews scheduled for deportation vanished from their homes. Food supplies flowed into the city in ways that defied logic. Kapler activated his spy network. Informants everywhere reported the same story: people disappearing, money moving, letters vanishing into thin air. The trail led straight to the Vatican. And straight to Hugh O'Flaherty. He was finally trapped, or so Kapler thought. The Irish priest had a simple rule: you can trap a body but you cannot trap a reputation. While the Gestapo watched the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, O'Flaherty was orchestrating deliveries, moving people and distributing money across multiple districts. Every step of his day was timed with military precision. Every courier knew exactly where to be, when to arrive, and how to avoid danger. The brilliance of the network was in its chaos. No one safe house looked particularly suspicious. Refugees blended in as ordinary citizens. Children ran errands. Priests acted as guides. Even the people who supplied food to the hidden houses had plausible stories. One particularly daring operation involved smuggling food. Farmers from outside Rome brought carts of hay into the city, ostensibly to feed horses. German soldiers prodded the hay with bayonets. They found nothing. But hidden deep inside each bale were sacks of potatoes, cheese, dried meat, enough to feed dozens of people. From there, O'Flaherty's network of street children distributed the food, running through narrow alleyways with backpacks full of supplies. It was a logistical masterpiece. A single priest managing the survival of thousands while his enemies believed him harmless. And the most dangerous part? O'Flaherty had begun training some refugees to defend themselves. Rifles, grenades, even stolen German Luger pistols were hidden away. He turned a network of civilians into a resistance militia, preparing them for the final days if the Germans decided to slaughter everyone before retreating. Yet despite the danger, he remained audacious. He continued walking the streets of Rome, disguised or in his priest robes, sometimes passing mere inches from Gestapo snipers and checkpoints. His nerve was a weapon. His confidence was armor. Kappler, frustrated beyond measure, escalated further. He raided safe houses with brutal efficiency, torturing anyone he captured to break the network. Still, the council endured. The Irish priest had transformed fear into strategy, brutality into discipline, and ordinary people into heroes. O'Flaherty had proven a truth. One determined man with courage, ingenuity, and trust could outwit an entire army. But Kappler wasn't done. The coming months would test O'Flaherty like never before. Lives would hang in the balance, and every decision would mean the difference between survival and massacre. The chessboard was set, and the next moves would be lethal. By early 1944, Rome had become a city under siege, yet paradoxically, it was also the stage for one of the most audacious games of cat and mouse in history. Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, the Irish priest, had turned the Vatican into a fortress of secrecy and hope. His network, once a small apartment and 3 soldiers, now protected thousands. Every day brought new risks, but nothing compared to what Kappler had planned next. Kappler, infuriated by his repeated failures, decided to escalate the threat. He painted a white line across St. Peter's Square, stretching from one corner of the piazza to the other. On the opposite rooftops, snipers took their positions. Every cafe, every street corner along the boundary was filled with Gestapo agents. Kappler sent a message with no chance of misinterpretation. Cross this line and you will die. It was a simple plan. Block the priest. Force him to surrender. Remove the head of the resistance and the rest would crumble. O'Flaherty's response? To treat the white line as another challenge. Evenings in St. Peter's Square became a spectacle of nerve. As the sun set, the basilica's doors opened. Out stepped Hugh O'Flaherty, tall, calm, and unarmed. He descended the steps, pipe in hand, stopping exactly 1 inch from the white line. There he stood, unflinching, staring across at the Gestapo. An ordinary man would have panicked. Most would have frozen. But O'Flaherty had a different strategy, audacity as armor. For hours he remained there, smoking his pipe, waving to the soldiers, sometimes greeting passers-by. Each movement was deliberate, a subtle signal to his network that the operation continued, that morale must never break. Behind the line, the Gestapo ground their teeth, rifles ready, eyes straining to spot any misstep. One wrong step, one inadvertent toe over the paint, and the priest would have been instantly executed. But he never faltered. While the Germans focused entirely on the man at the steps, his couriers moved like shadows through the back streets, slipping food, money, forged papers, and instructions to the hidden safe houses. The white line, meant to trap him, became a distraction, a deadly theater of misdirection. O'Flaherty's use of disguises intensified. One day he crossed the city dressed as a ragged laborer, smeared with soot from head to toe. Another, he became a postal worker, delivering letters in plain sight. And then came the day he did the unimaginable. He dressed as a nun. A 6'2" Irishman attempting to appear as a small, timid nun should have been laughable. Instead it worked. Confidence became his camouflage. He walked straight past soldiers, not avoiding their gaze, not running, and they looked away, unwilling to confront the absurdity of it. Kappler's frustration grew. The man he had threatened, hunted, and terrorized mocked his authority openly. Each escape, each successful delivery of supplies humiliated him further. Kappler considered raiding the Vatican itself, but diplomatic laws made it impossible. To storm the Vatican would have caused an international incident. Hitler did not want a Vatican crisis in the middle of a losing war. So Kappler's strategy shifted. Kill O'Flaherty outside the Vatican. Send a team in plain clothes. Wait for him during evening prayers. Grab him, drag him across the line, and deliver him to the Reich. But O'Flaherty was always one step ahead. That night, he strode toward a side door near the basilica. 4 men lay in wait, hidden, armed, ready to strike. He walked toward them deliberately, then veered left at the last moment, placing himself directly next to Swiss guards armed with halberds and concealed pistols. The would-be assassins froze, realizing they had lost the element of surprise. Their plan failed. O'Flaherty walked away unharmed, his nerves unshaken, his network still operational. The white line, intended as a symbol of death, became a stage for one of the most dangerous psychological standoffs of the war. The priest used it as bait, daring the Nazis to break protocol while ensuring that his couriers could carry out critical missions without interference. But Rome itself was now at the brink of starvation. The winter had been harsh. The black market soared in price, food was scarce, and thousands of refugees were hidden in attics, cellars, and safe houses. Some were eating rats, boiling leather belts to make soup. Every day without supplies meant desperation. Every night without protection meant death. O'Flaherty had to innovate again. He coordinated with sympathetic farmers outside Rome to bring carts loaded with hay into the city. German soldiers prodded the hay with bayonets. Nothing. Hidden inside were sacks of potatoes, cheese, and dried meat. Street children, some as young as 10, carried the supplies in backpacks, running through the maze of alleys to deliver the food to waiting refugees. Every move was timed. Every delivery a miracle. The white line, painted by Kappler to instill fear, had instead become a tool for salvation. O'Flaherty had turned the Nazis' obsession with control into an advantage. By forcing them to focus on a single point, he had free rein over an entire city. And yet, danger was never far. Every courier stopped, every delivery made, every disguise worn could have ended in death. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and 3,000 lives, or more, would have been lost. O'Flaherty understood this. He embraced the danger. It was the essence of his courage, to stand inches from death, knowing that hesitation was fatal, and yet moving forward regardless. The city watched, unknowingly, as a single man became a ghost. The white line was no longer a barrier. It was a symbol of resistance, a testament to the courage of one priest who refused to blink in the face of annihilation. Kappler could plan, threaten, and intimidate, but he could not stop the audacity, the ingenuity, or the courage of Hugh O'Flaherty. Rome was trapped between death and survival, and yet life persisted, all because of one man willing to risk everything for others. And the game was far from over. By the spring of 1944, Rome was a city on the edge of catastrophe. The Allies were advancing up the Italian peninsula, and the German army, once methodical and terrifying, was now in retreat. But retreat does not mean mercy. Kappler and his SS units had one mission left: leave nothing behind. Every safe house, every hidden refugee, every trace of resistance had to be destroyed. Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty understood the stakes. He wasn't just protecting lives, he was orchestrating a race against time. 4,000 refugees were scattered throughout the city, each depending on his guidance, each trusting that he would make the right move at the right moment. Failure was not an option. Supplies were running dangerously low. The Germans controlled the black market, seizing flour, meat, and potatoes for themselves. Refugees in cellars and attics were starving. Desperation hung in the air. Some had boiled leather belts into soup, others were scavenging whatever scraps remained. O'Flaherty knew that without a massive operation to move food into the city, many would surrender, exposing themselves to execution. He called upon every resource, every ally. Farmers from outside Rome brought carts full of hay, ostensibly for horses, but secretly packed with sacks of potatoes, cheese, and dried meat. The Gestapo prodded the bales, expecting to find contraband, or worse, people, but they found nothing. Street children ran the deliveries, carrying the food in backpacks, weaving through alleyways and dodging German patrols. It was a logistical masterpiece, an army of ordinary citizens, led by a single, fearless man, sustaining thousands in enemy-occupied territory. But as spring progressed, Kappler grew more ruthless. The SS escalated raids. Safe houses were stormed. Italian families who had aided refugees were arrested, beaten, and sometimes executed. O'Flaherty's network had already lost a few key couriers, and each loss sent waves of fear through the operation. The Irish priest refused to panic. He doubled down on his audacity. Disguises became more elaborate. One day he walked past checkpoints dressed as a ragged workman, covered in soot. Another day as a nun. Yet another day as a postal worker delivering letters. Every disguise had a purpose. Every movement was a calculated risk. O'Flaherty had begun turning his network into a militia. Rifles, grenades, and stolen German pistols were hidden in safe houses. Refugees who had once been defenseless were now ready to fight if necessary. Civilians became soldiers, all under the guidance of a priest who had never held a gun in anger but understood strategy better than most generals. Then came the explosion that changed everything. March 23, 1944. Italian partisans detonated a bomb against a column of SS troops, killing 33 German soldiers. Hitler was furious. His orders were immediate and brutal. For every German killed, 10 Italians must die. Kappler acted swiftly. He rounded up 335 men and boys, prisoners, Jews, political detainees, marching them to the Ardeatine caves outside the city. There he executed them one by one. The horror of their screams echoed through the tunnels, an ominous reminder of what happened to anyone who defied the Reich. O'Flaherty received the news the following morning. 15 of his friends, people who had risked everything to protect others, were dead. He could have collapsed in despair. He could have retreated behind the Vatican walls. But he didn't. Instead he doubled down. Time was running out. The Americans were closing in on Rome. Kappler's units, desperate and cornered, would attempt to destroy every remaining refugee and burn the city before retreating north. O'Flaherty knew he had 12 hours to safeguard 4,000 lives. He became a whirlwind of action. Driving his small Fiat Topolino through the chaos, he visited safe houses, checked on families, and instructed civilians to prepare for any attempt by the Germans to enter. Doors were locked, lights extinguished, weapons hidden in strategic locations. Every detail mattered. Every second counted. At one point, German trucks appeared near a convent filled with refugees. O'Flaherty did not flee. He emerged from the shadows, now in his full Monsignor robes, and confronted the SS sergeant. Speaking in perfect German, he shouted, "Is this how the Wehrmacht conducts itself? You delay the retreat while looting a nunnery?" The sergeant froze. He saw the red sash of the priest and realized he was dealing with someone of authority, and someone unafraid. Kappler's soldiers, already on edge, obeyed the orders of the priest rather than risk confrontation. They withdrew. Night after night, O'Flaherty raced through Rome, dodging patrols, ensuring food deliveries and securing safe houses. He became both shepherd and soldier, ghost and guardian, leading thousands to safety while the city teetered on the brink of massacre. June 3, 1944 was the climax. The Germans were desperate. Kappler had ordered a purge, intending to slaughter everyone in the safe houses before the Allies arrived. O'Flaherty knew this was the final countdown. He grabbed his cloak, his ledger, and stepped over the infamous white line for the first time in months. The Fiat roared through the streets, carrying him to one safe house after another. Each stop was a race against time. Each delivery a gamble with life itself. German tanks rumbled through Rome, trucks carrying stolen art sped north, and yet the priest remained calm, strategic, unstoppable. By dawn the Americans arrived. General Mark Clark's Fifth Army rolled into the city. The first Axis capital to fall. Refugees emerged from their hiding places, blinking in the sunlight, skeletal but alive. Thousands of lives had been preserved, not by guns, not by tanks, but by one man's courage, ingenuity, and sheer audacity. Kappler fled, his files, gold, and hatred in tow. O'Flaherty, exhausted but unbroken, began the task of rebuilding lives, reconnecting families, and restoring hope. Rome had survived the edge of annihilation. And at the heart of it all, one priest had turned fear into strategy, chaos into order, and impossibility into reality. Rome had survived. The American Fifth Army had entered the city, tanks rolling through the streets, the sound of artillery replaced by cheers and cries of relief. The occupation was over. The SS and Wehrmacht forces had fled, leaving behind empty streets, wrecked buildings, and thousands of lives hanging by a thread. Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, the Irish priest who had orchestrated one of the most daring resistance operations in history, now faced a new challenge: the aftermath. He had saved thousands, but the city bore the scars of war. Families were separated, friends were lost, and the trauma ran deep. O'Flaherty didn't celebrate. He didn't drink champagne. He walked straight into the streets, into the alleys and attics where his refugees emerged, fragile and terrified. His first orders were practical: organize food deliveries, ensure safe shelter, and begin reconnecting families torn apart by months of hiding. Every detail mattered. Every life mattered. But amidst the relief, one question haunted everyone: where was Herbert Kappler? The man responsible for the Ardeatine Caves massacre, the brutal raids, and the endless terror in Rome. Kappler had vanished north with his files and stolen gold. The war wasn't over, but justice demanded him. O'Flaherty knew that the Germans had left chaos in their wake, but he also understood the importance of formal justice. Months later, British Special Forces tracked Kapler down. He was arrested, tried for war crimes, specifically the massacre of 335 innocent Italians in the caves. The trial became an international spectacle. The world saw the monster of Rome confined, arrogant, unrepentant. He claimed he had only followed orders, the defense Nazi leaders often used. The court didn't buy it. Kapler was sentenced to life imprisonment, no parole, in the fortress of Gaeta, a prison on the Italian coast. O'Flaherty could have rested. His duty seemed complete. The city was liberated, the criminals punished. But his work was far from over. He had defeated Kapler tactically, militarily, but there remained a spiritual battle. Could a man who had murdered so many be redeemed? O'Flaherty made a decision that astonished all who knew him. In 1947 he traveled to Gaeta prison. A car pulled up at the gates and out stepped a tall, frail priest, his hair now white, his face lined with the fatigue of war and sleepless nights. He walked straight to the warden. "I am here to see a prisoner," he said simply. "Which one?" the warden asked. "Herbert Kapler." The warden thought it was a joke. Why would the man Kapler had tried to kill, the man who had lost friends and comrades to his cruelty, want to visit him? Was this a trap? A confrontation? Perhaps even vengeance? But Hugh O'Flaherty entered the prison calmly. Kapler looked up from his cot and saw the man he had hunted for years. The man he had tormented. The man he had hated more than anyone else on earth. And yet O'Flaherty did not shout. He did not threaten. He did not gloat. He simply sat on a stool across from the former SS colonel. "Hello, Herbert," he said. That simple greeting marked the beginning of a 12-year journey. Every month O'Flaherty visited Kapler in his cell. He brought books, cigarettes, conversation. He talked about Ireland, literature, the weather, small things, ordinary things, to remind Kapler that there was life beyond ideology and hate. At first, Kapler resisted. He was still the arrogant, unrepentant monster. He refused to speak, staring blankly at the walls, lost in his own bitterness. But O'Flaherty's discipline was unshakable. Month after month, year after year, he returned. No judgment, no fury, only persistence and quiet kindness. Over time, cracks appeared. Kapler began to speak. At first, cautiously, about trivialities, then about guilt, then about the 335 lives he had ended. The conversations grew deeper. O'Flaherty didn't condemn, he guided. He performed a spiritual exorcism, trying to pull the Nazi out of the man, to awaken conscience where there had been none. Finally, in 1959, 12 years after the visits began, Kapler asked for baptism. The man who had orchestrated mass executions now knelt before the priest who had saved thousands of lives. Hugh O'Flaherty poured holy water over his head, offering forgiveness, redemption, and a chance at spiritual renewal. It was extraordinary. Few could comprehend the courage it took not just to risk life in war, but to embrace mercy over vengeance in peace. O'Flaherty showed the world that heroism was not only measured in daring rescues and clever strategies, but also in the patience to change hearts, even the most hardened. By 1963, O'Flaherty's life drew to a quiet close. He died peacefully in his sister's garden in Ireland, far from the chaos and screams of war. He had no grand state funeral. He sought no medals or fame. But across the globe, 6,500 families remembered him. Those he had saved, those who owed their lives to his courage and ingenuity, paused in silent tribute. Today, the White Line in St. Peter's Square no longer exists, scrubbed away by time and countless footsteps. But his legacy endures. A plaque inside the German cemetery in the Vatican, a tree in the Yad Vashem Memorial in Israel, and the eternal reminder that one person can make a difference against the darkest evil. Hugh O'Flaherty's story is a testament to audacity, intelligence, and courage. But it is also a story of mercy, of forgiveness, of humanity prevailing where hate once ruled. The greatest weapon against darkness, O'Flaherty proved, is not firepower, not strategy, not even daring. It is courage to act and the will to forgive. The story of Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty didn't end when the Allies entered Rome or when Herbert Kapler was imprisoned. It didn't end with medals, honors, or newspapers reporting on his heroics. It lived on quietly in the lives of the people he saved, in the families reunited, and in the echoes of courage that whispered through the streets of Rome long after the war ended. By the time O'Flaherty returned to Ireland, the world had changed, but the memories of those perilous months in Nazi-occupied Rome stayed vivid. He lived modestly, far from the spotlight, spending his days in prayer, reflection, and small acts of kindness. Yet every time a story of bravery, of resistance, or of quiet heroism was told, the man who had stood 1 inch from death every day for 9 months, was never far from the conversation. History would remember him not for the violence he avoided, but for the lives he preserved. 6,500 souls owed their existence to one man who refused to blink in the face of terror. Each life saved was a story, a family, a legacy of hope. The children he rescued grew into adults. The families he protected rebuilt communities. The refugees he guided through shadows of fear went on to tell the story of the Irish priest who had walked through darkness unafraid. In Rome, traces of O'Flaherty's courage remained. Safe houses that had hidden thousands became memorials, and the streets where he had walked, disguised as a coal merchant or even as a nun, became silent witnesses to audacity and ingenuity. Yet the most powerful symbol wasn't stone, plaque, or marker, it was memory. It was in the quiet courage of ordinary people who, inspired by his example, continued to resist injustice wherever they found it. The story of the white line painted in St. Peter's Square, a line meant to divide life from death, became legendary. Germans stationed there, with their snipers and rifles, could not understand what they faced. O'Flaherty stood there, unarmed, unflinching, smoking his pipe, smiling, daring them to act, and in doing so he became more than a man. He became a symbol of resistance, a ghost of defiance that no bullet could reach. He had faced the worst of humanity, and yet he returned to mercy. The 12-year visits to Herbert Kappler were as audacious as any wartime operation. They demonstrated that courage wasn't only about facing death, it was about facing evil without letting it destroy your soul. O'Flaherty's patience and forgiveness were revolutionary acts in themselves. He didn't humiliate his enemy, nor did he seek revenge. He restored a sense of humanity to a man who had lost it entirely, proving that victory over tyranny could also mean victory over hatred. Back in Ireland, O'Flaherty's life was quiet, almost ordinary. But the world outside had learned a lesson from him. Ordinary men and women, armed with courage and conviction, can alter the course of history. The audacity of a single priest had saved thousands and humiliated one of the most feared men in Europe. His methods, disguises, forgery, courage under fire, were studied by spies and historians alike, a blueprint for ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. Even after his death in 1963, O'Flaherty's legacy continued. Families prayed for him. Children carried stories of his daring through generations. Memorials in Israel and the Vatican ensured that the name of Hugh O'Flaherty would never be forgotten. Yet perhaps the most profound testament to him was intangible, the courage he inspired in those who learned his story. The moral of O'Flaherty's life is as simple as it is powerful. Evil thrives when good people do nothing. One person, armed only with conviction, courage, and compassion, can change the course of thousands of lives. O'Flaherty's story reminds us that resistance doesn't always require weapons. Sometimes it requires audacity. Sometimes it requires patience. Sometimes it simply requires saying, "Not today," to the forces that threaten to destroy all you hold dear. Across the world, in countless cities, towns, and villages, children of those he saved grew up hearing about the priest who walked through death every day without flinching. They learned about the power of cleverness, the strength of courage, and the importance of compassion. Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty became more than a historical figure. He became a legend, a standard by which bravery could be measured. So, when you walk through the streets of Rome today, you might never see the white line. The cobblestones have worn smooth. Tourists tread without realizing the danger that once lingered in every shadow. But if you look closely, you can imagine a tall Irish priest standing there, smoking his pipe, smiling at death itself, daring it to move. Hugh O'Flaherty's life is a testament to the extraordinary potential of ordinary people. It is a story of courage, ingenuity, audacity, and mercy. A story of a ghost who haunted the Nazis with nothing but his wits and his faith. A story of a man who didn't just survive against impossible odds. He changed history, saved 6,500 lives, and left a legacy that will inspire generations forever. Remember the Irish priest in the coal merchant's hat. Remember the man who stood 1 inch from death and refused to blink. Remember that the greatest weapon against darkness is not a gun, not a plan, but the courage to act and the heart to forgive. This was the story of Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, the Scarlet Pimpernel of the Vatican, a hero whose legend will endure as long as there is light to shine in the shadows.